Kerech, we finally turn to the issue of the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah. Now that we have figured out exactly what a sukkah is supposed to look like and how it's supposed to be constructed, we get to the parameters of the mitzvah of sitting. And again, as is sometimes the way with the Mishnayot and the ordering of the Mishnayot, whereas we might have expected, the Masechet to begin with, there's a mitzvah to sit in the sukkah 7 days. Even if you're going to start with the issue of the construction of the sukkah, now that we get to the mitzvah, you might expect it to get to first laying out what are the basic parameters of the mitzvah, but rather it starts from the exemptions of the mitzvah. Similar as, in a way it does somewhat parallel the first Mishnah, which starts out what invalidates a sukkah. So but it's interesting that it starts out with the negative. So let's take a look at our Mishnah that deals with not yet what exactly the mitzvah is, but what exempts you from the mitzvah. So, shluchei mitzvah p'tur mina sukkah. People that are sent to do a mitzvah, literally, people that are traveling or on the way of doing a mitzvah are exempt from sitting in a sukkah. Cholin u'mishamsheim p'tur mina sukkah. Sick people and their attendants are exempt from the sukkah. Ochlin v'shosin arai chutz sukkah. You can eat and drink temporarily, meaning not in a sense of a fixed meal, but like a snack. You can do that outside of the sukkah. So these are things that can be done outside of the sukkah. Now, as I said, sometimes this is just the way a Mishnah begins. It begins with mentioning some of the exemptions. It sort of assumes we know there's a basic obligation, doesn't lay down the foundation, starts with the more interesting or the exceptions to the case. However, it is worth considering, and this is the point I want to come back to, that the reason it starts with the exemptions here is because if I were to ask you, what is the obligation of sitting in a sukkah? So you might say, well, if you're eating bread or mizonos, a certain amount of a kovei suda, then you have to do it in a sukkah, or the first night you have to do it in a sukkah, and that's what you would have said. We might not have even mentioned sleeping, because we don't tend to sleep in a sukkah, although as we've mentioned, according to the Mishnah, according to the Gemara, it's even in some ways more obligatory than eating, because even a temporary sleeping. But anyway, we would have started by that. But really, if you think about it, dwell in the sukkah 7 days. In some conceptual way, the mitzvah is to be living all the time in a sukkah. Everything is in a sukkah. Now, does that mean that the sukkah is a prison? That you can't step out of it? That you can't take a little drink outside of the sukkah? No, your house isn't a prison either. Okay, but you don't start by saying, you only have to, when you eat so much bread, you have to do it in a sukkah. The starting assumption is you're living in the sukkah. You're doing everything in the sukkah. So we start by telling you what doesn't have to be done in a sukkah, because we start by assuming everything is done in a sukkah. And that is a way of understanding why it is starting here with the exemptions. And that's, I think, going to be an interesting way about thinking about this, about thinking about fundamentally, living in the sukkah. That's where we start from, the idea. Okay, so let's take a look now as Gemara deals with these various exceptions.
Rabbi, you keep saying exception. How do we know that in this Mishnah, the language of patur does not mean patur of al asur?
No, you never have patur av al asur by a mitzvah saseh. Patur av al asur is when you deal with a transgression, which means you're exempt from the punishment, or more specifically, you're exempt from a korban chatat, but you still have, you might have still transgressed rabbinically or some technical, way. But this is about a positive mitzvah. Okay. Mars is like this. Minani mili. Where do you know this? That somebody who's doing a mitzvah is exempt from a sukkah. The Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught. This is a discussion in Brachot about the, as we're going to see, about a chassan, a groom saying Shema. B'shivtecha b'veitecha. It says that you shall talk about these, and you shall and you shall talk about the Torah, the Torah, and v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha v'lechtecha v'derech. So b'shivtecha b'veisecha prat lo seis b'mitzvah, to exempt you when you're doing a mitzvah, u'v'lechtecha v'derech, when you're going on the way, prat l'chassan, as excluding the case of a chassan. Now, why exactly Lechtecha B'derech has to do with a chassan? But we'll discuss in a minute. But somehow it means you talk about the Torah and you do those things, when you're normally just sitting around in your house or walking on the street, but not when you're involving yourself in a mitzvah, or not a chassan on his wedding night. We'll discuss that in a minute. Mikan Amru, from here they said, Hakoni says habetula patur. If a man is marrying a virgin, he is exempt from saying Shema at night. But if he's marrying a widow or a woman who's already been married, the divorcee would be included. Chayav, he's obligated. So that's very strange. Like, what the heck? I get maybe the osik b'mitzvah. What does that have to do with a chassan? And what's the distinction between a virgin and an almana? So let's take a look at the Gemara. My mashma, which is some ways what the Gemara asks. Where are you getting this from the verse? How does this verse suggest that you're exempt from doing mitzvot when you are already osek b'mitzvah? Now, first of all, I want to remind you that this is the specific locus of this braita is about the question of saying Shema. When they say a chassan is exempt, it means he's exempt from saying Shema on his wedding night. And the psukim, v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam, is understood by Chazal, like more generally in the pasuk, it's about Talmud Torah. You should talk about the words of Torah, right? But it's also understood to be talking about the mitzvah of saying Shema, right? That's in the pasuk of Shema. The pasuk of Vayayim Shema is you shall talk over these words. So therefore, they are reading it. When do you have to say Shema? When v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam? When do you say Shema? When b'shivtecha b'veitecha v'lechtecha v'derech, right? Think about the end of it. Ub'shachbecha v'kumecha. That's how we know the idea of a night of a nighttime Shema and a daytime Shema, when you go to sleep, when you wake up. So that verse is understood to be talking about Shema and exempting these two cases, the chassan and the person that is doing a mitzvah. So osek b'mitzvah. So what we're going to have to do is first of all understand this whole chassan idea, and then also understand why is it obvious that you can transfer that discussion of Shema to other types of categories like sitting in a sukkah. So let's take a look. So my mashma, where do you get it from? Amar Ravuna kiderech, because it says like a way. It says b'lechtecha baderech, like when you're on your way. Ma derech rishus, the same way going on your way, going on a journey is something that is like volitional. It's not obligatory. It's discretionary. Of course, whenever you're doing something discretionary, that's when you're supposed to say the Shema. Lafuke hai to be mitzvah asuk, to exclude a person who's involved in a mitzvah. Then you're doing something obligatory, not discretionary. Then you don't have to say the Shema.
So saying ba derech means cut derech.
Yeah. Or I'm not saying it's reading the ba as kid, but it may be. But I think what's also saying is anything like a scenario of going on the way, of when you're going on trips and when you're doing discretionary activities, as opposed to when you're not doing discretionary activities. So the Gemara says, how do you know? Milo askinan. What's to tell you that we're not also talking about the Kazal Dvar Mitzvah? Who says going on a journey means going on a discretionary trip? Maybe it involves everything that you do, even when you're going on the way to do a mitzvah. And the Torah is saying, read the Shema. Notice again the word likri, right? It's specifically in the context of saying the Shema. You should be Koreh Shema. So it says, no. Im kain limakra b'shevet u'belechet. It should say in sitting and in going. My b'shiftecha u'belechtecha. What does it mean? You're sitting and you're going. Belechet idach hu demechayevet. When it's your choice to be going, when it's something that you're doing, you're discretionary, then you have to say Shema. Habelechet mitzvah patiris. But if it's not something that's about you choosing to do it, it's an obligation you're doing because it's a mitzvah, then you're exempt. We sort of have this by Shabbos, right? We have the idea of chafetzecha asurim, right? V'cheftzei shamayim mutarim, right? So you can make all those shul announcements about things that, can't really be doing on Shabbos. We want everybody to be, donating to the upcoming dinner, and we're going to be having this thing or whatever. Why are you allowed to talk about it? Because it's chefsei shamayim. It's not about your types of activities. It's about religious types of things. So that's, again, the possessive sort of makes that the line between it. So here, too, when you're doing your activities, your discretionary activities, that's when you say Shema, not when you are going ahead and doing a mitzvah. Now, that explains maybe the normal idea of osek b'mitzvah. What does it have to do with the idea of a chassan? So before I address chassan, I want to introduce a very fundamental machlokas rishonim about what is the nature of osek b'mitzvah patamina mitzvah. There are those rishonim, like Rashi and Tosfos, that understand that the idea is that if I'm doing mitzvah A, I don't go ahead and do mitzvah B. It's only in a scenario where doing mitzvah B would take me away from doing mitzvah A. Okay? So let's say, for example, I'm saying the Shema. So if I were to stop saying the Shema to go ahead and give some tzedakah to an ani, I would have to stop saying the Shema. I can't be doing them both at the same time. But let's say, for example, I am I'm walking to do a mitzvah, and an ani is walking alongside of me. Well, he's not slowing me down for me to reach into my pocket and give him some money, so we wouldn't say osek mitzvah patur mina mitzvah. It's not stopping me. The only time we say patur mina mitzvah is a case where it would actually take me away from A. Now, some Rishonim ask on this. They say, if that's true, why do you need a pasuk to tell it to me? Because let's say you didn't have a pasuk, and you say, okay, you're doing A, but B comes along, stop A to do B. Then what would your next response be? If the idea is you're supposed to switch to another mitzvah that presents itself, so that, what? Well, okay, why should you be switching? And also, if you're telling me stop A to do B, then I should, as soon as I move over to B, I should stop B to go back and do A. So of course you don't stop one to do the other. Now there's answers to that. Let's say B is something that's more a passing mitzvah. A is a not passing mitzvah. B could be argued to be a more important mitzvah. Okay, so there's reasons that you would say, you would need this principle to say don't switch. But according to Rashi and Tosfos, the idea of osek mitzvah patur mina mitzvah is don't abandon A to do B. Other Rishonim read it in a more profound way. They say, no, if you're, and this maybe fits more the pasuk, b'shevet tidach u'belechet tidach, you only are obligated to do mitzvos when you're on your discretionary time. If you're already involved in a mitzvah, you don't have an obligation to do another mitzvah, even if that other mitzvah wouldn't take you away. The Torah is only putting the obligation of a mitzvah on you when you're free. When you don't have free time, as a word, not free being defined as any time that is being involved in your own things, but when you are already involved in a mitzvah, you're free from you are not, the other obligation is not imposed. So that means that even if I'm walking to go ahead and run to shul, theoretically, and an ani comes up to me and he's walking alongside of me, I'm osek b'mitzvah, even if it's not going to slow me down. I don't have to do it. I'm not obligated right now. I'm already involved in another mitzvah. Of course, to which point the response back is, so I don't get it. So do you mean that as long as you're walking around, let's say with tzitzis on, you don't have to do any mitzvahs? Because you're doing a mitzvah, you're free from other mitzvahs. So they say no. It's not mekayim mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah. It's osek b'mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah. If you're actively involved in it, that's when you're free. Not if you just happen to be getting mitzvah points because you happen to be wearing tzitzit.
Yeah, as long as you're not wearing shatzos, you wouldn't have to do anything.
Exactly. Okay, so these are two concepts. Now, why do I mention this? It's going to be relevant to understanding the Sukkah case, but it's also relevant to understanding the Chassan case. Why is a Chassan exempt from saying the Shema? Now, the most obvious explanation of why a chassan is exempt from saying the Shema, and this is the way it sounds like in the Mishnayos and Brachos, is because he's distracted. He can't have sufficient kavanah. Nobody would have ever suggested the idea of osek b'mitzvah. You might remember that there's the famous Mishnah where Rabbi Gamliel said the Shema went on his wedding night, and his students said to him, like, what? Did you teach us, chassan is exempt from the Shema? He says, Eini kishar kol adam, I can't deal even a moment without accepting O Malchus Shamayim, right? And then, but it seems like from the context of that discussion, that his point was like, he's also at this madrega, that he's able to have kavanah. Other people can't have kavanah, they'll be too distracted. So to some degree, it sounds like the issue of the chassan and Shema is an issue of distraction, which is actually going to come up in the Gemara. But the Gemara here is framing it not about distraction, but about osek b'mitzvah. So the question is, what type of an osek b'mitzvah is the chassan? So if you take a look at Rashi, right, Rashi says the following. Rashi says, it's about, 15 lines down in the medium-sized lines. The line starts with the word lichtav b'lechet paderech.
What do you mean the medium?
I mean, it's not the very last line of Rashi, which is the longest line of Rashi. Okay, anyway, let's say it's the wide lines of Rashi. Anyway,
Really long.
Okay, so anyway, Rashi says tarid, he's distracted, says Rashi. Libo tarud b'mechsheves bi'ilah. He's preoccupied with the fact that he's going to be having sex tonight. So notice Rashi says, and the idea I told you before, you can't do two things at the same time. You can't go ahead and start doing the Shema. It'll take you away from thinking about having sex tonight. But the point is, okay, but why is that like osek b'mitzvah? And why is that taking him away from doing the mitzvah that he's going to be doing tonight? So if you look at the last Rashi, not the last, but Rashi says, Tirda de Rishus. We'll get to that in a minute, but I'll just read it to you now because it's relevant, like 3 lines from the bottom. No, I'm sorry, not that one. 5 lines from the bottom. Chosam tari tirda de mitzvah. Don't stop thinking about the first mitzvah that came your way, which is the fact that you're in the process of getting married and you're going to be having sex tonight. Continue involving yourself in the first mitzvah. So, and make sure you know how to do it well. So according to Rashi, first of all, it's interesting. Why is it only about marrying a virgin? It should also be whether the chassan is a virgin. First time for the chassan, how much he has to do it. But Rashi understands that somehow the fact that he's preoccupied with this also means that he's going to be doing it better. It's really an osek b'mitzvah that is, and therefore to stop this and do something else would actually somehow compromise his ability to be Mekayim, the first mitzvah he's involved with. This is the type of thing you have to say if your understanding of osek b'mitzvah, patamina mitzvah, is by doing B, it takes you away from A. It compromises the performance of A. You have to somehow construct this case of the chassan on his wedding night, that it's not just that he's still preoccupied, but that actually not thinking about it will compromise, his performance tonight. That's what you would have to say according to Rashi. The other approach is much easier. The other approach is no. It doesn't matter that whether it's kind of compromise or not compromise. If we think that the chassan and kala having sex for the first time, frame that as a mitzvah, then by even mentally thinking about it, you're osek b'mitzvah, you're mentally osek, and that exempts you from other things. I don't have to say that by doing something else it will compromise this. It's not about compromising. Osek b'mitzvah, patmina mitzvah, exempts you from another mitzvah that comes along as long as you are asuk. But if you take a Rashi approach, it has to really be framed somehow as compromising, and that's strange. So just to repeat what we said, osek mitzvah patramina mitzvah, adredim rishonim, is it only if doing the other thing will compromise the performance of A, or even if it won't compromise the performance? Obviously you'd have to be defined as asuk, not just being makayim, but even if it won't compromise the performance. Why do you need a chiddush by chassan? What's the chiddush by chassan? Well, the chassan isn't physically being osek b'mitzvah. He's just being mentally preoccupied. And so that's a chiddush. That's why we need a separate pasuk by chassan. Even mental preoccupation is considered osek. But according to Rashi, what that leads you to say is the reason he's exempt is by doing something else that would compromise the mitzvah of being with his wife tonight. Whereas according to the other approach, you don't have to argue it will compromise. All you have to argue is that he's mentally preoccupied. That makes him osek b'mitzvah. Yes.
I never understood either these Gemarot or why Rishonim don't raise the following issue. An onain is also putter, but time passes,
yes,
and then the chiyuvim kick in again. You have the chiyuv to say the shema up until alot hashachar. So why can't the chiyuv?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know.
That's a big deal.
That's an interesting question. After they've had sex, say shema then.
Exactly.
Unless we assume that he falls asleep right away. I don't know.
He could always fall asleep.
Then he's an onus. But that's a very good question. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah.
Is it strange that?
Well, actually, I will respond to that, and I will say that, that what do you call it? That at the time of the Mishnah, at least, there was not yet the halacha of dam besulim is being treated as dam nida. So actually, they could continue to have sex even after the first act of sex. Now, you might say, but then it's no longer being then it's no longer being labeled as bias mitzvah. Only the very first act is being labeled as bias mitzvah. It's generally an interesting question, or maybe he's not asuk as much. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I should also say, why is that first act being labeled as bias mitzvah? According to some Rishonim, bias mitzvah. According to some Rishonim, it's because it's related to pruavu. Well, then everything is related to pruavu. So some Rishonim say enachinami. The chiddush is every act of sex is bias mitzvah. It's only that the first one, even the first one, is bias mitzvah because according to there's an understanding that you don't get pregnant from the first, from the first act of sex when the woman is a virgin. So he says even that is bias mitzvah according to some, not only that. Anyway, it's an interesting question of why this first one is labeled bias mitzvah. But anyway, it gets to your question, about what's the remainder of the evening. Yes.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask. If it's not Puru, is it going to answer? But it's this mitzvah on the same. It's not one of the prayers.
Right. So what is this? What is this that it's bias mitzvah? So yes, it either is pruavu, and then it's not only limited to this, but then you have to say that this is the only time that he's considered osek b'mitzvah. After they've had sex once, then yes, other times that they'll have sex is mitzvah, but he's not preoccupied. So the only case, it's not the other things aren't mitzvah, but this is the only time that he would be considered to be preoccupied with it. There are those that say it's considered bias mitzvah because of the idea that there's a Gemara that says, "Eina isha kareses bris ela misha asa keli." which is a very challenging Gemara, but okay. But basically that a woman who goes from being a virgin to a non-virgin, and this actually impacts her body, and it sort of makes it's her first a sexual experience in a way that changes her body in that way, that creates a very profound connection to her husband. So therefore, in a way, they'll say, so based on that concept, there's an understanding that this is being called bias mitzvah because it really sort of brings together in a very profound and deep way husband and wife. That first act of sex, and specifically focus on the first act. But you are right in the sense of, okay, but that's not one of the Taryag mitzvot. That could be a very nice and wonderful and important thing, but it's not one of the Taryag mitzvot. So that is also interesting, right? Why it gets labeled as a mitzvah. So all very good questions, and but getting back to sort of the particular focus here, let's take that as an assumption, and it is saying that therefore the chassan is considered to be osek b'mitzvah. So now let's see. Yeah.
The anti-Talmudic or anything, but it's possible that this is what Shishmar is overanalyzing this.
Well, yes, and that's what I said. That actually, the idea of osek b'mitzvah patur mina mitzvah as a global principle is not as obvious as the Gemara makes it sound. And if you actually look at the sources in Brachot, they sound much more that this is just an issue about the chassan being distracted and the ability to have kavana. And it's not about some big principle about osek b'mitzvah. Or maybe it's a principle that applies by Shema. Because if you think about it, right, Shema is about learning Torah. So if learning Torah is supposed to lead to the doing of Torah, so when you're doing a mitzvah, you don't have to be saying the Shema, which is all about the learning that leads to the doing. It's sort of like you're exempt also from Talmud Torah when, you leave Talmud Torah to do mitzvahs. You leave Shema to do mitzvahs. The way the Gemara globalizes it and turns the chassan into an example of osek b'mitzvah and turns this exemption of Shema into a global exemption of osek b'mitzvah is not so obvious from the earlier sources. But that is what the Gemara is doing. But now here the Gemara actually recognizes that chassan might be based on something else. So let's take a look. So the Gemara says like this. Ihachi, says the Gemara, afilu kones es halmani nami. So even if somebody is marrying an almana, it should be osek b'mitzvah. So here notice, although she's not a virgin, it still considers it to be a bias mitzvah. Okay, which is important. So it seems very clear, not based on that Gemara I said about the impact of, a woman having her first act of sex with her husband, but specifically that bia is a mitzvah, presumably because of pru'ervu. So if that's true, even if he's marrying a widow, he should be considered osek b'mitzvah. It's also a mitzvah there. So the Gemara says no. Konis amani nami. So the Gemara says no. Konis says absula tarid. Konis says amana lo tarid. No. In both cases, he might be doing a mitzvah. But in one case, he's preoccupied, so he's osek. And in the other case, he's not preoccupied. He's not osek. Okay, so now, because it uses the word tarid, the Gemara is sort of thinking that maybe it's not about mitzvah at all. Maybe it's only about being preoccupied, right? Which is exactly what probably pshat of that case would have been. So the Gemara says, you're telling me anytime somebody is preoccupied, they're exempt? Sort of dropping the concept of it being about mitzvah for the moment. Elamianta says the Gemara, if that's true, how about if some guy his ship sank in the sea? He just lost $1 million on the stock market. The Tarid, and he's preoccupied. Would you say he's exempt from the Shema? And maybe you'll say, yeah, maybe he is exempt from the Shema. He can't focus. Hama Rabbi Ava Bar Zavda, I'm a Rav, but Rav Ava Bar Zavda said in the name of Rav, Avel, a mourner, Chai b'chol mitzvahs hamus b'Torah, is obligated in all the mitzvahs in the Torah, chutz mina tefillin, with the exception of tefillin. Sharei nemer behen pe'er, because a pasuk in Yechezkel, which we'll see later, describes the tefillin as glory. And a chassan, an avel should not be wearing tefillin, which is like, being in a state of sort of glorifying. It's an insult to the mace that he is supposed to be mourning, to be, to sort of be wearing the tefillin that are considered to be glory. So that's the one thing he's exempt in, but he's not exempt in the Shema. So you see that being exempt in the Shema is, you see that being preoccupied is not an exemption. So the Gemara says no. So now the Gemara gets back to the fact that it's not being preoccupied alone. It's about being preoccupied with a mitzvah. Okay, so basically Let's look at what the Gemara did. The Gemara, for a moment, contemplated the idea that the exemption of Chassan was about just being preoccupied. It had nothing to do with Osek b'mitzvah. And it said, but that can't be. It can't be that anytime somebody is preoccupied, they're exempt by the Shema. We never hear that rule. We never hear that, oh, if you're too worried about your job and this or that, you're exempt from the Shema. And maybe if you want to suggest it's true, I'll give you even a counterexample. A mourner is obligated in the Shema. The only thing a mourner is exempt from the first day is tefillin, and we'll talk about that. But he's obligated in Shema. So you see, obviously, he's very preoccupied. I mean, he just lost a close relative, and nevertheless, you're obligated. So it's not just preoccupation. What it actually is it's tirda de mitzvah. Now, I do want to say that even if you said it was tirda de mitzvah, you wouldn't have to necessarily have framed it as osek b'mitzvah patur b'ina mitzvah. You could have said, if you are being torah de mitzvah, then what's exempting you still is the preoccupation, but you're not obligated to try to put aside the preoccupation because it's a mitzvah preoccupation. But still, it's a specific Shema issue about being able to have kavanah. It's just when you are preoccupied by other things, you're forced to bracket it so that you can have kavanah. Whereas when you're preoccupied with a mitzvah, you're not forced to bracket it because it's legitimate to be being preoccupied with a mitzvah. The Gemara, however, seems to, as I said, not be focusing on preoccupation as the basis for exemption. The fundamental basis for exemption is osek b'mitzvah, patur mina mitzvah. The point and the chiddush of the chassan is just that the preoccupation makes him to be considered to be osek. I think I made that too complicated for everybody.
Called the Yisha Erva Kriyat Shema. It's the same type of preoccupation. Huh?
Let's not go there.
Okay.
Anyway, so okay, I have a feeling I'm making this too complicated. So let me just try again to sort of summarize this. Okay, the case by the chassan being exempt could be just because about preoccupation, which the Gemara contemplates but rejects because based on the Avel, we see that even if you're preoccupied, you're still a person is still chayav in the Shema. So we're back to what we said square one, which is that we're framing it as osek mitzvah patur mina mitzvah. The idea by the chassan is that even mental preoccupation is considered to be osek b'mitzvah. The difference between the virgin and the widow is not that in both cases he's not about to do a mitzvah, but in one case, because he's preoccupied, he's osek b'mitzvah, and in the other case, because he's not preoccupied, he's not osek b'mitzvah. So yes, preoccupation matters, but it matters to define you as osek b'mitzvah. And at the end of the day, the exemption is based on osek b'mitzvah. Again, it is interesting that it is considering sex on the wedding night with the almana as a mitzvah. That's not the difference whether it's a mitzvah or not a mitzvah. The difference is whether he's considered osek b'mitzvah. Now, the other interesting thing that emerges from this is that it makes it sound like an avel being preoccupied with the person who just passed away is not considered tirda de mitzvah. It's considered tirda de reshus. Right? It's as opposed to the chassan who's planning on, having sex that night, right? So that's actually a little surprising. You might have thought that the whole idea of avelus is to give you the opportunity to be reflective and to think about these things, and maybe we would call that also tirda de mitzvah, right? If the avel is thinking about the person who just passed away. So look at Rashi, 3 lines from the bottom, tirda de reshus. I always find this Gemara fascinating, that it labels the thinking about the mace as tirda de reshus. So Rashi says, "She'afal pishu chayav lino gavelus shel ne'ilah v'chitza v'sicha l'haras kavod meso eno chayav lihitzdayer." So Rashi says, interesting, all of the various manifestations of avelus are not necessarily just manifestations of pain and suffering. They're ways of demonstrating respect, in the sense of respect that, like, the death had this tremendous impact on you, but not necessarily there's not necessarily an idea of being afflicted. It's quite fascinating because you would think that the whole reason that the acts of avelus are acts of demonstrating respect is they show how the loss has created the sense of devastation, right? You're now the person on the ground, he's not wearing his shoes. It's like, why is it respectful? It's respectful because it shows how much that loss has impacted on the person. So, the idea that having a sense of suffering or these types of thoughts is a tirda de reshus, I have a very hard time getting my head around. I mean, you could say that the avelus period is a period where you're supposed to be sort of reconciling yourself to it. It's a period of tanchumim. It's after the aninus. Aninus is when it's completely a sense of devastation, and then you are exempt from mitzvot because by the period of aninus, you are supposed to only be thinking about the mace. The avelus is the next stage. It's the stage of being consoled and reconciling and sort of working through it. So they are, maybe it is, what the statement is, it's unhealthy to be overly mitzta'er, but I still think it's a very fascinating statement in the Gemara that that's considered tirda de rishus, So, all right, let's keep on going. So the Gemara says like this. Are you telling me you learn out osik mitzvah patimina mitzvah from the Shema case? Mehasav nafka, you learn it from a story of Korban Pesach. Titania, we turn on the Brisa. There were people that were tamei for impurity of bodies, and they couldn't do the Korban Pesach, and they came to Moshe, and that's where we got Pesach Sheni. Who are those people? Nosei Arono Shel Yosef Hayu. They were the ones that were tummy because they had been carrying Yosef's coffin. Like Kach Moshe Moshe Yosef Himo. So Divi Rabbi Yossi Aglili. That's what Rabbi Yossi Aglili says. Rabbi Akiva says Mishael ve'el Tzafan Hayu. They were Mishael ve'el Tzafan, who were the nephews of Aaron, who were the ones that took Nadav and Avihu out of the Mishkan when they the fire consumed them. Shayu Oskim b'Nadav Avihu, and that's how they became tamei. Rabbi Yitzchak said, no, that can't be. He says, look, they made the Pesach when they were encamped still at Har Sinai. Okay? They had been encamped at Har Sinai for about 10 months. And then they made the Korban Pesach right, at the following Nisan. So they had been whoever carried the coffin of Yosef put it down when they arrived at Har Sinai. And then it's been 10 months since he's been there. They've had enough time to become tahor. Now, also the question is, when were they told about paraduma, about how you could become tahor? So according to Chazal, that happened at Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So anybody that was tamei before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, they had 15 days to become tahor before Pesach. So it couldn't have been the people that were tamei with Yosef's coffin. And even if it was Mishael ve'el Tzafan, that story of Nadav and Avihu being consumed was on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, according to Chazal. So they also had 15 days to become tahor. Ella oskim b'meitz mitzvah hayu. No, they were just stam people who were involved in some burial of a dead. Meis mitzvah sometimes has a technical term that nobody else is burying this person, but the way Rashi says it means no, just they were burying a relative. Shechal shvi shelahem b'gidlios be'erev Pesach, and it just so happened that their relative died a week before Pesach, and their seventh day was Erev Pesach, and therefore they were still tamei. Now, why do you have to say their seventh day was Erev Pesach? Maybe it was the third day. Shenamar, the verse says, "V'lo yachlu lasos haPesach bayom hahu." They couldn't do the Pesach on that day. They couldn't do it on that day. If it had just been one day later, they could have done it. Okay, so he uses this to say that it was the last day that they were tamei, the seventh day. They couldn't be tahor, but if it had been one day later, then they would have been able to become tahor, and they would have been able to bring the korban Pesach. So now, by the way, this is fascinating because what it also shows you is Chazal's desire to basically tie up loose ends. Like you just have a passage which is like some random people came and said to Moshe, we're tamei. Chazal said, who were those people? Oh, maybe we can connect it to the people who brought Yosef's coffin. Maybe we can connect it to Mishael ve'el Tzafan. These are other people we know were tamei. And then, of course, Rabbi Yitzchak makes a very cogent argument, and he says, no, you're just going to have to accept we don't know who these people were. They were just some anonymous people who had for some unknown reason, had become tamei. But again, it's interesting, the desire to take the story, which is very general, and make it more concrete and tie it into people and to events that we're aware of. And Chazal tend to do that a lot when you have like anonymous people, like the person who goes out, right, and Vayetze b'machaneh, and he curses God, right, and they try to tie that into a very concrete person in a very concrete event. So here they're trying to do the same thing. Okay, so yes.
We know that the time period between the darkness in Egypt and the Exodus for so many days.
Oh no, because you're basically about the Chazal that like everybody that even the Jews, even when Israel died, yeah, according to that Medrash. But that was also a very long time. But anyway, they didn't have like a para aduma in Egypt. So if people had become tamei over the course of their slavery, how did they become tahor? So I don't know. It's probably a tumahutra b'tzibur in that case. Anyway, so. But that is actually quite fascinating, that it's only concerned about the people who carried the Aron of Yosef. What about people that had been tamei their whole lives? How did they become? Maybe it assumes that like at Har Sinai it was like because the Gemara uses Har Sinai as a paradigm for conversion. Maybe they all became like Katan Shinola Dami. It sort of restarted everything at Har Sinai. I don't know, but it is an interesting point. Forget the Medrash about the plague of darkness, right? When did anybody become tahor? Right? They've all been tamei. So anyway,
it's a nice interplay between Agad and Halacha.
Yeah.
Really
right. But the point here, though, is regardless of who it was, the point is that, well, not so much regardless. If we assume the reason they became tummy was because they had a mace, they had a berry, so now the Gemara is bringing this into the discussion of osek b'mitzvah patur mina mitzvah. Now, why? What does this have to do with osek mitzvah patur mina mitzvah? Because the implicit point in the Gemara is, why did you bury this body, your relative? You knew Pesach was coming up a week from now. So you should have just, not done it so that you could have brought the Korban Pesach. It must be, since this is the first mitzvah that you encounter, you have an obligation to do it. Now, again, but what does that have to do with osek mitzvah patur mina mitzvah? Right? Osek mitzvah patur mina mitzvah is while I'm doing this, I don't stop to do something else. Here it means that I know that doing this will obviate something in the future, but this is the one that's in front of me now. This is the one that I do. It doesn't really seem connected. It really only works to some degree if your idea of osek b'mitzvah is don't compromise A for the sake of doing B. Right? If that's your idea, if I'm already doing A, don't compromise A for the sake of doing B. Then I could say, oh, so I shouldn't compromise this, this case of this dead body for the sake of a future Korban Pesach. Then at least there's some type of a comparison about the idea of osek b'mitzvah patur mina mitzvah. So that seems to be what the Gemara is saying, which works in with that model of osek b'mitzvah. So don't you see we have this principle already from Korban Pesach? So the Gemara says no. You need both examples. Had you just had the Korban Pesach model, it's like I'd say, it's much less of a relevant example. That says go ahead and do A because B is only in the future. So it's not telling you the principle when you encounter B, don't do B. You haven't encountered B yet. And even though you'll encounter B a week from now when you bring the Korban Pesach, at that stage you're already tamei. Right? So the choice that you're making right now to choose A is when B is not in the picture. Okay, so then it's much more obvious that you choose A. Here, where you're doing your mitzvah, you're in the middle of A and B comes along, it's not so obvious you keep on choosing A. Now that B came along, maybe you go and you do B. Okay, it's a different scenario. Amalo, maybe not. Tzricha. So you need to tell me that even if as you're doing A, B comes along and presents itself, don't stop A to do B. Okay, so that's a much better example. So had you just had this case here about the Kriyas Shema, Mishum Deleka Kares, fine. That tells you don't go ahead and do B when it bumps into you, because if B isn't so important, if B isn't a big weighty mitzvah that you would get Kares for. But if the B that came along, but thereby the Pesach, the Iko Kares, that the Korban Pesach is punishable by Kares, it's a very, very weighty mitzvah. Amala, maybe in that case, you would abandon A to do B. Tzricha, you need both cases. So from Korban Pesach, we learn, don't stop A to do B, even if B is more important, right? Even though Korban Pesach is more important. And from Kriyas Shema, we learn that when you're in the middle of doing A, and B encounters you, and B is presenting itself right now, don't stop A in order to do B. Tosfos, of course, asks that what we don't have is the combination of the two. Let's say you're in the middle of doing A, and then B comes along, and B is kares, or B is more important, right? So you see, we have one case where you did A before B was around. B was much more important, but B wasn't on the scene yet. We have the other case, you're doing A and B comes on the scene, but that's when B isn't so important. What happens if you're in the middle of doing A and B comes along and B is much more weighty, right? If I'm in the middle of saying Shema, but if I don't stop Shema right now, like, I don't know, it's somehow right before nightfall. If I don't stop Shema, this baby isn't going to get a bris milah, right? So what? I don't osek mitzvah patur mina mitzvah? Do we say no? In that case, it's not like B is on the scene and it's more important. So what is the limit to that idea of osek mitzvah? Tosfos raises that. What happens when you have the combination of the two? But these two for the Gemara create this principle of osek mitzvah patur mina mitzvah, which again, according to some Rishonim, means don't do it if it's going to mean that you're going to have to compromise A. And according to other Rishonim, means even if you're not going to have to compromise A, if you're doing A, if you're involved in doing A, you never stop A to do B. Okay, are there any limits to that in terms of how important B is? That's a little bit of an open-ended question, but that is the basic principle, and the basic source is Shema, although Pesach adds to that issue. And again, by the Shema, we would have said maybe that the idea of chasan was based on distraction. We could have easily have said that the Shema example is not relevant. The chasan is based on distraction, and the idea that you stop Shema to do other things, you don't stop other things to do Shema, is because the whole idea of Shema is like Torah, and Torah leads to doing, and you don't stop the doing in order to do the Shema. We could have bracketed that entire case. But the Gemara treats the Shema as a basis for a global principle of osek b'mitzvah pater mina mitzvah, and explains chasan not because the distraction per se is what exempts him, explains chasan that his distraction defines him as osek b'mitzvah, as mentally being osek b'mitzvah. And the case of the difference between B'sul and Alman is not if there's going to be a mitzvah, but how much is he mentally osek b'mitzvah, and sees it all through that lens. Okay, and now that we have laid that all out, that is what we are going to say is the exemption by Sukkah. Okay, that Sukkah, the reason they're exempt when they're shluchei mitzvah is because to stop doing it will mean that they're already involved in a mitzvah, so they don't have to stop to do another mitzvah. Now, what does that mean? Like, okay, it's one thing when they're on their journey. They don't have to stop and find a sukkah to stop and eat. It's going to take them away from, getting to wherever they're going. They're going, let's say, to be pigeon shvuyim is an example Rashi has. All right? But let's say it's nighttime. They got to sleep somewhere. Why should they go to the Holiday Inn over there if they can just go to their friend that's got a sukkah, right? Why does that exempt them? Just because they're osek b'mitzvah. So if you take a look back on Tzchaf Hamad Aleph, and the Tosfos shluchei mitzvah. Tosa says the following. He quotes Rashi. Even when they're going to sleep, when they're camping out. Whether day or night. It sounds like the reason you have to underscore even at night is because you're not traveling at night. You're only traveling in the day. The okay, and then he says why. So now here's the question. He says So Tosfos says like this. You skip to the end of the Tosfos, v'tzarich lomar, like the last two lines of Tosfos. So he says, why are you exempt? The hachanami iri b'chiyai gavna. You have to construct a scenario where it's easier to go to the Holiday Inn and they'll get a better night's sleep. And if they would have to go and look for a mitzvah to sleep in, it'll first of all take away from their time, they won't sleep as comfortably, and it'll have some impact on their kiyum mitzvah. So according to Tosfos, if your idea of osek b'mitzvah is don't do B if B will compromise A, the reason these guys who are traveling to do a mitzvah are exempt from sukkah is only in a scenario where sitting or sleeping in a sukkah will somehow compromise their mission, right? Like the Blues Brothers, we're on a mission from God. So if they're on a mission from God, right, and the going to a sukkah will somehow compromise it, it's a problem. But according to the other approach, you don't have to argue that it will compromise. The other approach says it doesn't matter. If you're in the process of doing a mitzvah, even when you go to sleep, this is part of the process of traveling to do this mitzvah. It's all part of being osek b'mitzvah. And therefore, you are just exempt from sukkah. I don't have to say that it will compromise, even if it won't compromise my doing of the mitzvah. I'm osek b'mitzvah, I'm exempt from sukkah. So this is exactly this machlokes. Do you have to argue to be exempt that it's doing the other thing will compromise? According to Tosfos and Rashi, who say yes, they have to construct the scenario where finding a sukkah to sleep in or eat in will compromise the mitzvah. According to the other approach, you don't have to argue that. As long as you're osek, and even sleeping is part of being osek in this scenario, then you're exempt. Yes, Dov, what do you want to say?
Just simply, but both shitot, it's an expansive definition of osek b'mitzvah. It's not, you're not osek b'mitzvah, ach barak, when like you're giving the money to do the
Well, sure, but you see that already from the chassan. The chassan is osek, he's A, not doing it, and B, is only thinking about it.
So even if you take away the psychological piece, it's the entire process.
Totally.
It's totally process.
Right.
Yeah.
What?
Where do you draw the line? So these people are on a mitzvah mission.
Right.
So they're exempt from sukkah, right?
Right.
What other mitzvah are they exempt from?
Right. So presumably they'd be exempt from saying the Shema. They'd be exempt from
Why?
Right. You mean why? What's why is it getting in the way?
How involved they are.
Right. So this is the question. If you say only if it compromises, so then you're not going to exempt them from most things. But if you say even if it doesn't compromise them from doing it, then it seems like they've got like this blanket exemption, and so therefore the Rishonim that say that you're exempt even if it doesn't compromise you, sort of a little bit qualify it and say, of course, if it's like totally trivial to do the other thing, you're not, you shouldn't not do it, because it becomes too much of an extreme position. You're right. Here I am, I'm traveling.
You're on the boat going somewhere, you have nothing to do on the boat while you're going.
Exactly. So, yeah, and maybe they are. I know. Right. Right.
You have nothing else to do.
Right, exactly. So the Rishonim try to say that, they try to pull back from the extreme implications of this position and say, like, when it's completely trivial to do this other thing, you don't, then you have to, or then at least you should. But you're right, it becomes extreme. Okay, let's go back to the Gemara. Gufa. Remember, we're going to look at this Avil story. Is obligated in all mitzvot except for tefillin, where it says glory. That's an inappropriate. It would be disrespectful to the mace to be involved in something that's described as glory. Because there's a whole thing that God has Yechezkel take a wife and then say the wife is going to die, and you're going to, and this is going to be a sort of a metaphor for the fact about what's going to happen to Bnei Yisrael and how they'll be bereaved and so on. So, and then in that thing where God commands Yechezkel what to do when the wife dies, it's quite funny because some of the things God commands Yechezkel to do are acts of Avelus. Some of the things that God commands Yechezkel to do is to specifically not act like a normal Avel. So Chazal learned from Yechezkel practices of Avelos, but sometimes they learn because we do the reverse of what Yechezkel did, and sometimes they learn because it is what Yechezkel did. So some of the things are acts, and some of the things are contrary to acts. So let's take a look. God says to Yechezkel, "Pe'ercha chavosh alecha," put your glory upon you. Atu de mechayeves. You are obligated to wear your glory, which is understood to be tefillin. Avakuleyam apatiri. Everybody else is exempt. That's only on the first day. The immediate aftermath of the death is like a bitter day, and that day in particular is so bitter that you are exempt from tefillin. Obviously, to exempt you from a mitzvah is a big thing, so we won't extend it beyond the first day. I should say two things. First of all, some of the Rishonim explain that the reason is, or connect this to a debate, that some say Avelus, the first day is Dioraisa. There's a question whether any practices of Avelus are Dioraisa, but those that say it is limited to the first day. So that might also be connected to exempting you from tefillin. But the other point is important to note, that because it's acknowledging the bitterness of the first day, and some of that bitterness is contrary, it's not appropriate to counter that bitterness with the wearing of tefillin. So you could say it's not appropriate to the Avelos to be wearing tefillin, or the other way. Somebody that is in such a bitter state, it's not appropriate to the tefillin, which it's not appropriate for one mitzvah for those mitzvahs to intersect. It compromises the Avelos and compromises the tefillin with that degree of bitterness. But again, it's quite fascinating, because here we're acknowledging that first day is considered this day of bitterness, but we're still, remember, obligating him to say the Shema. And the Gemara says that sense that he's might preoccupy is tirda de rishus. Even on the first day, even when this idea of bitterness is a day that is a reason we use to exempt him from tefillin. So again, the idea that the Gemara calls the sort of tsar of an avel tirda de rishus, even on the first day, even at the same time when it uses his mental state to say why does not wear tefillin, to me is a very challenging idea.
In Jerusalem, where the minhag is to bury at night, the next morning would be the first day. Is this a minhag that the Avel does not wear tefillin?
So it's
here you'd never see it, because the kavur is going to be in the morning or in midday.
Yeah,
and that's the first day. So they would already the second
day
is the first morning.
Yeah, so it's a longer discussion about the about how to exactly define what the first day is, particularly in this question of the first day being Dioraisa. It might only be like Yom HaKavura, and then and then the following night. So it's a good question, but let's back it in. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Is that a supply? Because I've been to burials in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
All I know is it's minhag Yerushalayim, they will bury it tonight. That's all.
Okay, depends where the death goes. Oh, let's keep on going. Okay. The Amarav Ava Barzav Damarav Avel Chayiv b'Sukkah. An Avel is obligated in a Sukkah. Right now, we've already identified that his preoccupation is not preoccupation of a mitzvah, so that should be obvious. So the Gemara says pshita. That's obvious. So Mao detema. I might have thought, "Hov Amarav Bar Zavda Amarav Mitztar Pater Mina Sukkah." Since we have the same person, Rav Ava Bar Zavda, in the name of Rav, who says that an Avel is exempt, somebody who's in pain, who's suffering, is exempt from a Sukkah. Hi Nami Mitztayer, who this person is also suffering, right? Same idea that we've been talking about. Kamash Malan, Hani Militzara Dimi Mela. That is suffering that comes from out, like by on its own accord. Here, this Avel is bringing it upon himself. He should try to settle down his mind. So again, quite fascinating how the Gemara seems unsympathetic to the Avel's tsar. Again, maybe because we're supposed to be moving from the sense of tsar to a sense of nechama, and says this Avel should be just calming himself down. Now, it's quite fascinating that the Gemara says this, because the normal reason we understand a mitzvah is pater mina sukkah is because being in the sukkah is the source of the tsar. You're being in the sukkah, and there are bugs and there are gnats, and the sukkah is the source of a tsar. So you don't live in a house where the house is causes you tsar. So you go somewhere else. You go where there's no tsar. That's not the way you live. You don't live in a place where there's all these bugs and gnats and so on. But if the person is in tsar, regardless of where he is, what's the line? Wherever you go, there you are. So if a person is in tsar, wherever he is, why should he be pater from a sukkah? It's not that the sukkah is the source of it. So the Gemara shouldn't be saying, the person should get rid of his tsar. It should just be saying the sukkah isn't the source of the tsar. So that's pretty much how Rashi explains it. If you look at Rashi, like 10 lines from the bottom, Tsara dimi mela, Rashi says, Shehasukkah mitzaraso. The sukkah is the source of the tsar. Kigon chama, otzina, osircha, bidvarim shesichich behen, or smelliness. And here that's not the case. So it's interesting, though, because the Gemara, didn't seem to say that. Didn't seem to say the reason you're chayiv is the sukkah isn't the source. It seemed to say that the reason you're chayiv is because this Avel needs to handle it himself, which raises the possibility that the idea that a mitzvah is exempt from the sukkah could be even when the sukkah isn't the source of the tsar. Right? Because then the Gemara should have said that here. The Gemara should have said the reason the Avel is chayiv is because the sukkah isn't the source. It doesn't say that. It says because we're not willing to give any credit to his tsar. So let's say somebody is a high degree of discomfort. Here's a common scenario, right? Somebody really has a high degree of discomfort. He's not exactly sick. I don't know. Let's say he's got a terrible rash. Okay, he's got mosquito bites all over his body. He's got a terrible rash. He's just highly discomforted. He'll be that discomforted wherever he is. Does he have to sit in a sukkah? So you could say, the sukkah isn't the source of the tsar. Or you could say, no, maybe mitzvah pater mina sukkah just means that whenever you're in that state of tsar, and we can discuss why that would be, doesn't matter why, but it doesn't matter what the source is, you don't have to be in a sukkah.
Okay, so is the Avel, right?
No, tsar di mimela is the case when you're exempt, when it's not something that the Avel is bringing upon himself. Okay? So again, what we have here is a very open-ended, ambiguous Gemara. On the one hand, fascinating, as I said, that it assumes that it doesn't give credit to the tsar of an Avel, which is just fascinating to notice. It did that already 2 or 3 times. It did not give any credit to that. But why is an Avel obligated in a sukkah? Why doesn't he fall into the category of mitzvah? And there are 2 ways of arguing it. One is mitzvah is only an exemption when the sukkah is the cause of it. Okay, then fine. Then you don't have to say that the Avel needs to get rid of his tsar. It's just the sukkah isn't the cause. That's one way of explaining, because the sukkah isn't the cause. The other way of saying is that mitzvah is always pater mina sukkah. It doesn't matter what the cause is. But the reason the Avel is not is because we just don't give any credence to his tsar. We say, you have tsar, deal with it. Okay, and therefore that's not a legitimate. But it doesn't. But a mitzvah that can't get rid of it, even if it's not based on the sukkah, might really be pater mina sukkah, and that's an interesting question. Okay, so again, quite fascinating how much the Gemara is discounting the tsar of the Avel. Okay, I think we will end here. So we did a lot conceptually, not so much textually, but a lot conceptually. Okay.